In the summer of 47 BC, a boy was born in Alexandria who should have ruled the world. His mother was the Queen of Egypt, the last pharaoh of a dynasty that had governed for 3 centuries. His father was Julius Caesar, the most powerful man in the Mediterranean, the conqueror of Gaul, the master of Rome. The child was named Ptolemy Caesar, but the people of Alexandria called him Caesarion, Little Caesar, and in that nickname lay both his destiny and his death sentence. He was the only son Julius Caesar ever publicly acknowledged, the only male heir to the greatest fortune and the most dangerous legacy in the ancient world. For 17 years, this boy stood at the center of a storm that would destroy the Roman Republic, reshape the Mediterranean, and end the 3,000-year civilization of pharaonic Egypt. And then, in a single brutal decision, the man who would become Emperor Augustus ordered him hunted down and killed, erasing him so completely from history that we do not even know what he looked like. Rome did not just murder Caesarion. Rome tried to make the world forget he ever existed. But the story of this forgotten prince reveals something that Augustus desperately wanted to hide, something about power, legitimacy, and the terrifying threat posed by a half-Egyptian boy who might have had a better claim to Caesar's legacy than Augustus himself. Before we trace the life and death of this erased prince, we need to understand the world into which he was born and why his very existence terrified the most powerful men in Rome. If stories of ancient power and forgotten heirs intrigue you, consider subscribing to join us as we uncover more of history's buried secrets. The circumstances of Caesarion's birth were scandalous by any standard of the ancient world, but they were particularly explosive in the context of Roman politics and Roman law. Julius Caesar was married to Calpurnia Pisonis, a Roman noblewoman of impeccable lineage who had been his wife since 59 BC. Roman marriage was a serious legal institution with profound implications for inheritance, citizenship, and political alliance, and Caesar's marriage to Calpurnia connected him to one of Rome's most influential families. For Caesar to father a child with a foreign queen while still married to a Roman wife was not merely adultery. It was a statement of contempt for Roman social norms and a potential threat to the entire system of family-based political networks that held the Republic together. The child born from such a union would have no legal status in Rome. He could not be a Roman citizen. He could not inherit Roman property. He could not hold Roman office. In the eyes of Roman law, Caesarion simply did not exist, regardless of whose blood flowed in his veins. But Cleopatra did not care about Roman law. She cared about Egyptian law, and under Egyptian law, her son was legitimate, royal, and divine. The Ptolemaic dynasty had long practiced sibling marriage and other arrangements that Romans found abhorrent, and they had their own traditions of legitimacy that did not depend on Roman approval. Cleopatra proclaimed Caesarion as the son of Caesar from the moment of his birth, gave him the name Ptolemy Caesar to make that claim explicit, and began presenting him as her co-ruler and heir while he was still an infant. Egyptian temples inscribed his name alongside hers. Egyptian priests declared him a god, the son of a god, the living Horus who would rule the 2 lands for eternity. In Egypt, Caesarion was not a bastard or a scandal. He was a pharaoh, and his father's Roman identity only added to his prestige by connecting the ancient kingdom to the dominant power of the Mediterranean world. The question that haunted everyone then, and haunts historians now, is whether Julius Caesar actually accepted this child as his own. The ancient sources are contradictory and politically motivated, making it nearly impossible to determine the truth with certainty. Cleopatra obviously had every reason to claim that Caesar was the father, since that claim legitimized her son and connected her dynasty to Roman power. Caesar's enemies had every reason to deny his paternity or to suggest that Cleopatra had other lovers, since acknowledging the child would have enhanced Caesar's already dangerous prestige. The sources that support the paternity claim include Plutarch, who wrote that Caesar allowed Cleopatra to name the boy after him, and various Egyptian inscriptions that proclaimed the relationship openly. The sources that cast doubt include statements attributed to Caesar's associates and the simple fact that Caesar never legally adopted Caesarion or included him in his Roman will. The truth probably lies somewhere in the ambiguity itself. Caesar likely believed or accepted that the child was his, but he also understood that formally acknowledging a half-Egyptian son would create political problems he was not prepared to solve. What Caesar did do was bring Cleopatra and Caesarion to Rome in 46 BC, installing them in a villa across the Tiber River where they lived openly for nearly 2 years. This was an extraordinary provocation. Foreign monarchs did not typically reside in Rome for extended periods, and a foreign queen who was also Caesar's mistress and the mother of his unacknowledged son was a constant reminder of his unconventional personal life and his growing detachment from Roman norms. Caesar compounded the provocation by placing a golden statue of Cleopatra in the temple of Venus Genitrix, the temple he had built to honor his family's divine ancestor. Venus was the goddess from whom the Julian clan claimed descent, and placing Cleopatra's image in her temple suggested a connection between the Egyptian queen and Caesar's own semi-divine lineage. Some Romans interpreted this as a sign that Caesar intended to make Cleopatra his queen and Caesarion his heir, establishing a hereditary monarchy that would rule both Rome and Egypt. Whether or not Caesar actually planned such a thing, the fear that he might was enough to fuel the conspiracy that ended his life. The Ides of March in 44 BC changed everything for the 3-year-old boy in Alexandria. When the senators' knives cut down Julius Caesar on the floor of the theater of Pompey, they killed not only the dictator, but also any chance that Caesarion might be legitimized as a Roman heir. Caesar's will, opened after his death, named his grandnephew Gaius Octavius as his adopted son and primary heir, with no mention whatsoever of the child in Egypt. This was the moment when Caesarion's fate was truly sealed, though it would take another 14 years for that fate to be fully realized. Octavius, who would rename himself Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus and eventually become Augustus, now held the legal claim to Caesar's name, fortune, and political legacy. Caesarion held only the biological claim, the blood connection that Roman law did not recognize, but that everyone knew existed. These 2 boys, one in Rome and one in Alexandria, one 18 years old and one barely 3, were now locked in a competition for Caesar's legacy that only one of them could survive. Cleopatra fled Rome immediately after Caesar's assassination and returned to Egypt, where she faced a transformed political landscape. The Roman world was descending into civil war, and she needed a new alliance to protect Egypt and her son. She watched as Octavian and Mark Antony formed an uneasy alliance against Caesar's assassins, as the Battle of Philippi in 42 BC left the Roman world divided between the 2 triumvirs. When Antony summoned her to Tarsus in 41 BC, Cleopatra saw an opportunity to secure the alliance she needed. The meeting at Tarsus began the relationship between Cleopatra and Mark Antony that would define the rest of both their lives. Cleopatra arrived on a golden barge with purple sails, dressed as the goddess Aphrodite, in a spectacle designed to demonstrate the wealth of Egypt. Antony was captivated by her intelligence and political acumen. She was offering Egypt as an ally, with all its grain and gold, in exchange for Roman protection for her dynasty. Antony gained the resources he needed to dominate the eastern Mediterranean. Cleopatra gained a protector who could secure her throne and her son's inheritance. Caesarion grew up in Alexandria during the years of his mother's alliance with Antony, raised as the crown prince of Egypt and educated in the Greek intellectual tradition that had made Alexandria the cultural capital of the Mediterranean world. The Library of Alexandria was the greatest repository of knowledge in the ancient world, and Caesarion would have had access to its scholars, its texts, and its accumulated wisdom as part of his royal education. He was taught Greek philosophy and rhetoric, Egyptian religion and ritual, mathematics and astronomy, and the other sciences that flourished under Ptolemaic patronage. He was also taught to be a king, trained in the ceremonies and protocols that a pharaoh needed to master, inducted into the mysteries of Egyptian religion that made him a god in the eyes of his people. But alongside this Egyptian identity, Cleopatra made sure that Caesarion never forgot his Roman heritage. He was Caesar's son, and that connection was essential to his mother's political strategy and to his own future as a ruler who might one day need to deal with Rome as an equal. The relationship between Caesarion and his three half-siblings, the children Cleopatra bore to Mark Antony, is one of the great unknowns of this story. Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene were twins born in 40 BC, and Ptolemy Philadelphus was born in 36 BC. In 34 BC, Antony staged the donations of Alexandria, distributing eastern territories to Cleopatra and her children. Caesarion was proclaimed King of Kings and joint ruler of Egypt. His siblings received Armenia, Cyrenaica, Syria, and other territories. These donations were largely symbolic, but they represented a vision of a new Eastern Empire ruled by Cleopatra's children. The donations of Alexandria were the final provocation that Octavian needed to justify war against Antony and Cleopatra. He had been building his case for years, portraying Antony as a degenerate who had abandoned Roman values for Oriental luxury, who had fallen under the spell of a foreign witch, who planned to move the capital of the empire from Rome to Alexandria and rule as an Eastern despot with his Egyptian queen. The donations provided perfect evidence for this narrative. Here was Antony literally giving away Roman territory to the children of his foreign mistress, treating conquests paid for with Roman blood as if they were his personal property to distribute. Octavian read Antony's will to the Roman Senate, claiming that it requested burial in Alexandria beside Cleopatra, and the Senate responded by declaring war, not on Antony, who was still a Roman citizen, but on Cleopatra, the foreign queen who had allegedly corrupted him. The legal fiction allowed Rome to fight a civil war while pretending it was a foreign conflict, but everyone understood the reality. This was a war between Octavian and Antony for control of the Roman world, and Cleopatra and her children were caught in the middle. The Battle of Actium on September 2nd, 31st BC was one of the most decisive naval engagements in ancient history, and its outcome sealed the fate of Caesarion and everyone he loved. The forces of Antony and Cleopatra faced Octavian's fleet in the waters off western Greece, and the battle quickly turned into a disaster. Cleopatra's squadron broke through the enemy line and fled south toward Egypt, and Antony abandoned his own fleet to follow her, leaving his ships and his soldiers to surrender or be destroyed. The reasons for this decision have been debated for 2,000 years. Was it cowardice, love, a prearranged escape plan, or simple tactical error? Whatever the cause, the result was catastrophic. Antony and Cleopatra reached Egypt with a fraction of their forces, their allies melting away, their treasury depleted, their reputation destroyed. Octavian did not pursue immediately. He did not need to. He could take his time, consolidate his gains, and let the knowledge of inevitable defeat do his work for him. The final year of Caesarion's life was spent watching his mother's world collapse around him. Antony fell into depression and paranoia, alternating between desperate schemes to rally resistance and fatalistic acceptance of defeat. Cleopatra tried everything she could think of to save herself and her children. She sent messages to Octavian offering to abdicate in favor of her children. She reportedly tried to have her fleet dragged overland from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea so she could escape to India. She tested poisons on condemned prisoners to find one that would kill quickly and painlessly when the time came. Through all of this, Caesarion remained in Alexandria, now 17 years old enough to understand exactly what was happening and what it meant for his future. He had been proclaimed King of Kings and co-ruler of Egypt, but his kingdom was crumbling and his Roman enemy was approaching with overwhelming force. In the summer of 30th BC, Octavian's legions arrived outside Alexandria, and the end came quickly. Antony's remaining troops deserted to the enemy. Antony himself, believing falsely that Cleopatra was dead, fell on his sword and was carried to her monument, where he died in her arms. Cleopatra was captured by Octavian's soldiers and placed under guard, though she was initially treated with respect as a defeated queen, who might yet be useful for Octavian's triumph in Rome. Octavian met with her personally, and ancient sources disagree about what happened in that meeting. Some say she tried to seduce him as she had seduced Caesar and Antony. Others say she tried to negotiate for her children's lives. Still others say she realized immediately that no negotiation was possible and began planning her death. What is certain is that Cleopatra died on August 12, 30th BC, almost certainly by her own hand, probably by poison, though the famous story of the asp may be legend. She was 39 years old, and she chose death over the humiliation of being paraded through Rome in Octavian's triumph. But before she died, Cleopatra made one final attempt to save her eldest son. She sent Caesarion south toward Ethiopia with a large treasure and trusted guardians, hoping he could escape through the Red Sea ports to India, where he would be beyond Octavian's reach and might someday return to reclaim his inheritance. It was a desperate plan with little chance of success, but it was the only chance she could give him. The guardians she chose included his tutor, Roden, a man she trusted with her son's life and future. She could not have known that this trust was misplaced, that Roden would betray Caesarion in exchange for his own safety, that the man responsible for educating the prince would be the man responsible for his death. Roden convinced Caesarion to turn back toward Alexandria, reportedly telling him that Octavian intended to make him king of Egypt, that his mother's fears had been unfounded, that a glorious future awaited him if he would only return. The 17-year-old boy believed his tutor. Why would he not? And headed back toward the capital. He was intercepted by Octavian's soldiers and brought to Alexandria as a prisoner. The decision about what to do with Caesarion was made quickly and without apparent hesitation. Octavian consulted with his advisors, and the philosopher Arrius Didymus reportedly provided the decisive counsel. Arrius quoted a line from Homer about the dangers of multiple rulers, adapting it to suggest that too many Caesars was a bad thing. The advice was elegant in its literary quality and brutal in its implications. Caesarion had to die because he was Caesar's son, because his very existence challenged Octavian's claim to be Caesar's only heir. There could not be two men in the world with a legitimate claim to that name and that legacy. One of them had to be eliminated, and Octavian had the power to decide which one. The execution was carried out shortly after Caesarion's return to Alexandria, probably in late August of 30th BC when he was 17 years old. No ancient source describes how he died or what was done with his body. He simply vanishes from the historical record, erased as thoroughly as if he had never existed. The thoroughness of that erasure is one of the most telling aspects of Caesarion's story. Octavian, now styling himself Augustus after 27 BC, spent decades carefully constructing his image as the legitimate heir and successor of Julius Caesar, the man who had avenged Caesar's murder and fulfilled Caesar's vision for Rome. This image depended on the legal adoption that Caesar's will had specified, but it was always shadowed by the knowledge that biological heirs existed whom the law did not recognize. By killing Caesarion and allowing Cleopatra's other children to live, Augustus made a clear statement about what kind of threat he feared. The children of Antony were Roman, and they could be absorbed into Roman society, displayed as trophies, married off to loyal supporters, neutralized through integration. Caesarion was different. Caesarion carried the name Caesar not by adoption, but by blood. He was the son of Julius Caesar in a way that Augustus could never be, and that biological fact could not be neutralized or integrated. It could only be destroyed. The physical evidence of Caesarion's existence was largely destroyed along with him. No confirmed portraits survive from antiquity. The images that are sometimes identified as Caesarion, a relief at Dendera, some coins from Cyprus, are disputed by scholars and may represent other members of the Ptolemaic family. We do not know what he looked like, whether he resembled his father or his mother, whether he had Caesar's famous features or Cleopatra's Macedonian Greek heritage. We do not know what his personality was like, whether he was brave or timid, intelligent or dull, ambitious or resigned to his fate. The few anecdotes that survive are too brief and too politically motivated to reveal anything meaningful about the person behind the royal title. Caesarion exists in history as an absence, a void where a person should be, defined entirely by what he represented to others rather than by who he actually was. The question of his paternity remains unanswered and probably unanswerable. Modern DNA analysis could theoretically resolve the question if Caesarion's remains were ever found, and if a reliable sample of Caesar's DNA existed for comparison, but neither condition is likely to be met. Caesar was cremated after his assassination, and Caesarion's burial place, if he was buried at all, is unknown. Some historians have argued that the paternity question is irrelevant, that what matters is not whether Caesar was biologically the father, but whether he and Cleopatra claimed that he was, since that claim alone was enough to make Caesarion dangerous to Octavian. Others have argued that the question is central to understanding the period, since a genuine son of Caesar would have had a moral, if not legal, claim to Caesar's legacy that might have attracted supporters and destabilized the new regime. The argument continues in academic circles, with no resolution in sight, which is perhaps appropriate for a figure whose entire existence is shrouded in uncertainty and political manipulation. What is not uncertain is the impact that Caesarion's birth, life, and death had on the transformation of the Roman Republic into the Roman Empire. His existence was one of the factors that drove the conspiracy against Julius Caesar, since the senators feared that Caesar intended to establish a hereditary monarchy with his Egyptian son as heir. His existence was central to the propaganda war between Octavian and Antony, since Octavian used the specter of a half-Egyptian ruler to terrify Romans into supporting his cause. His death was the final act in the elimination of all alternatives to Augustan rule, the last removal of anyone who might have challenged the new emperor's legitimacy. In a sense, the Roman Empire was built on Caesarion's corpse, not because his death caused the empire to exist, but because the empire could not have existed in its Augustan form as long as he remained alive to complicate the question of succession. The three children of Cleopatra and Antony survived where Caesarion did not, and their fates illuminate the specific nature of the threat he posed. Alexander Helios and Ptolemy Philadelphus disappear from the historical record after being displayed in Octavian's triumph, probably dying young of natural causes or being quietly, eliminated once public attention faded. Cleopatra Selene, however, lived to adulthood and was married to King Juba II of Mauritania, a Roman client state in North Africa. She and Juba ruled together for decades, had children, and created a court that blended Greek, Roman, and Egyptian culture in ways that echoed her mother's Alexandria. Cleopatra Selene never threatened Rome because she was a woman and because her father was Antony, not Caesar. She could be neutralized through marriage to a loyal client king, transformed from a potential enemy into a useful tool of Roman diplomacy. Caesarion could not be neutralized in this way. His threat came from his name and his blood, and those could not be taken away or redirected. They could only be ended. The memory of Caesarion persisted, despite Augustus's efforts to erase it, kept alive by Egyptian priests who continued to inscribe his name in temples, and by historians who recorded his story even as they debated his paternity. He became a symbol of lost possibilities, the prince who should have ruled the world but was destroyed by politics and power before he had a chance to prove himself. Romantics imagined what might have happened if he had survived, if he had reached India and built a kingdom in exile, if he had returned with an army to reclaim Egypt, if he had somehow outlived Augustus and pressed his claim as Caesar's son. These fantasies ignore the political realities that made his death inevitable, but they capture something true about the tragedy of his situation. Caesarion was killed not for anything he did, but for who he was, not for any crime, but for the accident of his birth. He was 17 years old, probably frightened, certainly betrayed by people he trusted, and he died because a name that should have been his greatest asset turned out to be his death sentence. The story of Caesarion is ultimately a story about legitimacy, what makes a ruler legitimate, how that legitimacy is established and maintained, and what happens when competing claims to legitimacy cannot be reconciled. Julius Caesar's legitimacy came from his military victories, his political alliances, and his personal charisma, not from any hereditary right to rule. When he died, that legitimacy could not be automatically transferred to anyone, regardless of blood or legal adoption. Octavian spent years building his own legitimacy through his own victories, his own alliances, his own carefully crafted image as the restorer of the Republic and the bringer of peace. Caesarion threatened that project simply by existing, by representing an alternative source of legitimacy that Octavian could not control or co-opt. The adopted son and the biological son could not both be Caesar's heir, and the one, with the armies, would inevitably destroy the one without them. 2,000 years later, Caesarion remains one of history's great what-ifs, a figure defined by potential that was never realized. He was born into the most powerful family in the ancient world, raised as a god-king in the wealthiest kingdom of the Mediterranean, and killed as a teenager by a man who feared his name. He never commanded an army, never ruled independently, never had the chance to show whether he would have been a worthy heir. All we know is that he existed, that he mattered enough to be murdered, and that Rome tried very hard to make the world forget he had ever lived. The boy who was born in Alexandria in 47 BC should have ruled the world. But he was betrayed by his tutor, captured by his enemies, and executed on the orders of a man who could not tolerate a rival Caesar. He was 17 years old. He was the last of his line. And he was erased so thoroughly that we do not even know what he looked like. Rome did not just kill Caesarion. Rome tried to make him disappear. But the story of the son Rome tried to erase from history continues to be told, continues to remind us that legitimacy is always contested, that power is always fragile, and that the children of great parents often pay the highest price for the accidents of their birth.